I do think the way that it's presented, where you get these momentary flashes of probably more, mine's always going to go to darker places.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast, where we discuss the world of film from a fresh angle. And now your host, Robert Yanis Jr.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast. This is Rob. On this show, we democratize the film criticism conversation by bringing on fans and critics alike to talk about their personal connection to a current or classic release. This episode, we're talking about the 1997 sci-fi horror film Event Horizon, and I'm honored to welcome back to the show Jon Cohorn. Welcome back to the Crooked Table Podcast.
Thanks so much, Rob. It's good to be back.
So we're releasing this episode like right in the early to mid-January range. So I wanted to kind of pick your brain a little bit as far as tell listeners what you who you are, what you have going on, where they can find some of your work, and then we'll get into my other question. As I mentioned to you right before we recorded, this is the first time I recorded in a while, so I'm kind of getting back in the mindset.
Sure thing. We'll both get up to speed. Again, I'm Jon Cohorn. I'm a writer for modernhorrors.com. I've been a film fanatic most of my life. When I was a teenager, I worked as a projectionist for years, back when that actually involved 35 millimeter film all the time. When I was in college, I worked in an indie video store that was not too far removed from what you see in Clerks, and have just been, an avid movie watcher for the rest of my life. Most of what I watch is horror, but there's other genres sprinkled in there throughout.
Yeah, it's cool because the last time you came on the show, we talked about John Wick and that franchise and how it's an action franchise, but there's like elements of horror in there, especially the first one where he's essentially, Keanu Reeves as the boogeyman. So
right.
That was kind of an interesting cross section of genres in a way. And now we have sci-fi horror more directly, obviously, as far as the horror element is concerned. So, as far as 2019, looking back on the year in film, what are some of the ones that that really stood out to you that you found yourself revisiting?
I'm just going to say that we have been really, really fortunate in 2019. There has just been a strong slate of films throughout most of the year. Some of the things that are probably going to be on my best of are things that I saw at film festivals and may not actually see a wider release until 2020. But just off the top of my head, some of my favorites have included Josh Lobo's I Trapped the Devil, which is very much in the vein of a Twilight Zone kind of story. Also, a movie that blew me away out of Tribeca is called After Midnight. That movie was originally released under the title Something Else. The literal title was Something Else. And it's Jeremy Gardner and Christian Stella. It was produced by Benson and Moorhead, and Justin Benson plays a role in it. And it's this just incredibly heartfelt mix of character study and romantic comedy and creature feature that I loved. And it completely took me by surprise. We've already spoken about John Wick. I loved that. Midsommar is one of my top movies. I've seen that like 8 times now. Wow. There was a little film that I reviewed out of Fantasia this year called Sator, Sator. It's almost a one-man affair behind the camera. It's a very small cast, and it's based on some real events from the director's life, and it's got some imagery in it that's very, very potent and haunting. On top of that, Takashi Miike's new film First Love was excellent. The Vast of Night is like a 1950s UFO story that I believe has been picked up by Amazon Studios. They're going to give it a theatrical release sometime in 2020, and then it'll hit Prime streaming. Spectre Vision's The Color Out of Space blew me away. It is probably the best cinematic representation we've seen of H.P. Lovecraft yet. Benson and Moorhead pop up again with their new film Synchronic about a drug on the streets of New Orleans that causes people to travel through time and space. It's amazing. The Lighthouse, that thing is going to be divisive, I think, with some, but I loved it. And it's got one of the most striking images I've seen on screen all year. Getting closer to the end of the year, something that completely surprised me when I saw it in theaters was A24's Waves. I did not have any expectations, and that movie brought me to tears. And it's also got a great soundtrack by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, who have been super busy the last couple of years. A24 continued that streak with Uncut Gems. Easily the best thing that Adam Sandler has done in years. And then I actually just watched another movie from Spectre Vision that took me by surprise. Daniel Isn't Real, which is kind of like this psychosexual head trip of a movie that also incorporates some of the more psychedelic imagery that we saw in films like Mandy. So again, that's a whole long list for the listeners to maybe chase down if any of that sounds interesting. But 2019 was a bumper year for great film.
Yeah, I noticed. I think you mentioned at least 3, probably maybe even 4 A24 movies in there. And they really continue to kill it. I did an episode not long ago on The Farewell, which was another one of their big breakouts this year, because they did Waves, they did Midsommar and The Lighthouse, and they're really and Uncut Gems, I think too. They're a really consistent source of really I don't know, I don't want to say cutting edge, but really like unique voices, and it's like a creative haven for these filmmakers to really go apeshit with their visions, or whatever genre that may be. And I thought that was, I just wanted to point out the fact that you brought up A24 several times. I'm like, well, A24 had a really strong year.
That's been on my mind. That's been on my mind quite a bit the last couple of days. Yeah. Both A24 and Spectre Vision as well has done some incredible work this year, or 2019/2020. And a large part of it is championing voices and stories that other studios probably wouldn't touch and definitely wouldn't give the same kind of push and prestige to. So I'm game for just about anything that either of those studios puts out at this point, even if it's something that on the surface it seems like I might not be into.
I think you're seeing that with a lot of production companies now. I feel like a lot of them are starting to embrace more like the Blumhouse model, where here you go, here's $5 million, go figure it out, and just kind of these micro budget films where the filmmakers are then able to retain essentially full creative control because it's such a small, financial risk on the studio's part or the production company's part. And I think that I really hope that's a trend that we continue to see more of, because it's really been bearing fruit. I know A24 specifically, again, to go back to them, they've had a lot of success as far as award season's concerned and things like that in the past. So hopefully we'll see more production companies really kind of embrace that model, because it tends to really yield interesting, if not divisive work in some cases.
And at the very least, it's fodder for conversation and discussion. And, some of these movies I just want to dive into and experience over and over and over, as you can tell by how many times I've watched Midsommar.
Right.
But, seeing voices like that, Ari Aster, Robert Eggers, the care and the detail that they put into their films is really just what's the hook in my mouth.
Yeah, I feel like it was Spielberg a few years ago who said that the industry is kind of just bifurcating in these huge, like $300 million movies, and then the little, like $5 to $10 million. So we're going to see just more. A24 and Marvel are going to be the last studios standing, basically. Those are your options. So, but yeah, I think those are a lot of really great recommendations. I actually haven't even seen some of those myself. I think Midsommar, I don't know if I connected to it as much as you, but it's definitely one that it's been on my mind. Like it's still kind of haunting me a little bit, the ending of that movie. And yes. I remember coming out of the theater and, not to spoil the ending for that movie, but the ending, you're just like, what the fuck? It's like, it's a very impressive ending, the way that story is resolved. And again, not to spoil for people that haven't seen it. So I came out of there kind of shell-shocked. And one of my good friends' brothers, who still lives, my friend Aveen moved away, but his brother's still local. So I came out and he was there randomly, just like he had been at the movie theater with another friend who went in that movie and was like going to meet them. So I came out and was like, oh, a friendly face, exactly what I needed coming out of Midsommar. Just like had to like process that movie. So yeah, I think Ari Aster and Robert Eggers and all those. It's been a really good year for movies, regardless of the genre that you're into. So I'm looking forward to digging into Event Horizon with you, since it is obviously more directly a horror film.
Yes. And, before we get too far into it, as I was going back and watching it again, and I guess over the last couple of days, this has been my second and third watch of it in roughly the last year. Earlier this year, the Alamo Drafthouse in Austin showed a 35 millimeter print of it as part of their Terror Tuesday screenings. And so that was the first time that I had ever seen it on the big screen. I didn't catch it when it was first released theatrically. I got turned on to it when it hit DVD a few years later. And so I watched the theatrical cut on the big screen earlier this year. And then as we were preparing for tonight, I went and watched the director's cut or the extended cut that they put on DVD some years back. And there are all of these little connections and tangential relations that started to pop up in my mind. First and foremost, this is very much a film that strikes me as Hellraiser in space, which is a little bit odd because just a year earlier, Hellraiser Bloodline had come out, which was the fourth Hellraiser film, had kind of a problematic development. The director took his name off of it, but a good portion of that movie is set in space. And on top of that, then you have Sam Neill playing a character that in some ways is similar to the character that he played in John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness a few years earlier. This man experiencing things that are so far beyond human experience and comprehension that it kind of drives him insane. And then on top of that, you have Laurence Fishburne just a couple of years before he takes that iconic turn as Morpheus. But there are parts of the film where you can kind of start to see that connection. They're in this kind of old rundown ship, and it's just kind of interesting to see all of these threads at play. None of them are really direct connections, but it's in my mind as I go through and watch this film again.
I definitely picked up on some of those, especially The Matrix, which is essentially one of my favorite movies. Having Laurence Fishburne as a captain of a kind of rundown ship, I definitely picked up on some of those parallels. And the movie, I think just aesthetically, it really reminded me of, not even like the story at all, but it reminded me of a little bit of something like Dark City, which I talked about on this podcast with Jeff Johnson, who we both know from CF3. And so I think there was something about this sort of not techno noir, but like this. It was a very similar late '90s kind of EDM soundtrack aesthetic of like this was what we all thought the future was going to be like, or at least cinematically.
And it's this strange combination of both high tech and low tech.
Yeah.
You have these spaceships that are able to bend space and time and travel across the universe. But then you also have data stored on, optical discs like a CD, or you've got a section where they're trying to translate the Latin and the guy is using an old school tape recorder. So it is this kind of like high tech, low tech that reminds me of, the original Alien or things like Firefly or other sci-fi programs that blend the two together.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get any further into talking about the film, let's listen to a little bit of the trailer for Event Horizon right now.
At 0300 this morning, TDRS picked up an automated navigation beacon broadcasting at 2-minute intervals in Neptune orbit.
This is incredible. It's the Event Horizon. She's come back.
Event Horizon is the culmination of a secret government project to create a spacecraft capable of faster-than-light flight. The ship doesn't really go faster than light. What it does is it creates a dimensional gateway that allows it to jump instantaneously from one point of the universe to another light years away.
Where's she been for the last 7 years, Doctor?
That's what we're here to find out.
After 7 years in deep space.
There were 18 people on board this ship when it disappeared. I want them all accounted for.
Opening outer door.
It came back, abandoned.
Any crew?
Negative. This place is a tomb.
But it didn't come back alone.
That was a little bit of the trailer for Event Horizon, directed by Paul Anderson. Later would officially go by Paul W.S. Anderson, not Paul Thomas Anderson, totally different filmmaker. I think that's so funny that you have those two directors with such similar names who couldn't be different as far as their style, their place in the industry, and all that stuff. I just did an episode recently on Punch Drunk Love, so it's kind of funny to be doing another Paul Anderson movie. So this one came out August 15th, 1997. It did $26.7 million at the box office against a $60 million production budget, so not a big hit at the box office. And you mentioned that you hadn't seen this in its original theatrical run. So when did you come across it, and what was your initial reaction?
So the first time that I saw it was its initial DVD release. So that probably, if I had to guess, was around 99 or 2000, maybe a little bit earlier. And then a couple of years later, they put out an expanded version that had the extended cut on it and had the commentary and some supplemental features and things like that. I don't remember even hearing that much about it when it was initially released. You know, Paul Anderson at that point was not really a household name. I think prior to Event Horizon, he had made 2 films. One of those was a Soldier, which came out when I was working in a movie theater, and I didn't even watch that, even though I watched pretty much everything. And then he did Mortal Kombat. And so Mortal Kombat was this huge success here in the United States. Also had a very electronic music heavy soundtrack, if I remember correctly. And after that, he was pretty much given carte blanche to do whatever he wanted. And he was actually offered the opportunity to do an X-Men movie after Mortal Kombat, but he turned it down because he wanted to do something darker and a little more scary. And Event Horizon is what came out of that. And in the commentary at the beginning of the film, he's talking about some of the influences and some of the things that he wanted to do. And he said that he had this idea of he wanted to do a film that was kind of a haunted house in space. And the 3 films that he referenced as inspirations as they were working on this were The Haunting, The Shining, and 2001, which I thought was kind of an interesting combination of influences.
It's like Alien minus the alien, too, a little bit, as far as, you know, which, again, that film has a very haunted house in space concept behind it.
You're absolutely right. And, you know, there has been argument here and there about whether this film is an Alien ripoff or anything like that. And in the commentary, they specifically mention Alien as being an influence on the look of the film, you know, the structure of the ship, the way that it's lit, the way that it looks. So I can see that, but I think that specific influence goes a little bit further because I get a similar feeling with the crew. You know, you've got a crew, you don't really know a whole lot of their background, but just from their interactions, you see that they've all got, you know, different experiences and different specialties, but they've kind of come together as this family, for better or for worse, out in the middle of, you know, of this vast emptiness.
Yeah, and that's where the Alien parallels really came into my head, because obviously the Alien tagline that everybody knows is "In space, no one can hear you scream." Well, this one is basically like, in space, no one can hear crazy shit happen, basically. and it's really exploring the terror of the unknown that happens in space. And what I thought was interesting about this film, and where it takes it a step further, is that it's blending sort of science and faith in a really interesting way, where they're kind of almost one and the same.
Yes, it looks at where those potentially intersect. And I think that they leave it open enough to interpretation to where everybody can come to their own conclusion. You know, they don't actually say this is, you know, the textbook definition of hell from a religious sense. Right. But in human understanding, everything that we see from that dimension and from that experience and what comes through certainly seems like it.
Yeah, it does. I mean, and they talk. There's a great exchange with Fishburne and Neill, who we'll get into their performances in a minute, where he says, I think he says something like, "Oh, into hell," or something like that. Fishburne says, and then Weir is like, "Oh, hell is just a word. What I'm talking about is much, much worse." That kind of thing, where it's like. Again, it reminds me think of something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which I was a big fan of that show, where she died and went to this other dimension, which was not technically heaven, but sort of kind of heaven. It's like that kind of deal where it is what you perceive it to be. And I think that's really that's a really interesting way to view the afterlife in whether it's just a different plane of existence scientifically or whether there's some kind of spiritual component there. I think the movie, as you mentioned, I think the movie does kind of toe that line in an interesting way.
Yes, absolutely. And so the theatrical version did have a good number of bits cut out, sometimes even single frames, because there are brief flashes as the movie goes on of what happened to the previous crew and what they experienced when they went through the wormhole, and they're pretty horrific.
Mm-hmm. I did a little bit of research on that. That there was all kinds of like mutilations involved. I think there was some sex acts happening, and based on my research, it said something about that they hired like porn actors to make everything seem like more realistic with that regard and stuff. So the ironic thing behind this movie is that, as you said, he turned down other movies, including Mortal Kombat Annihilation. Good decision, Paul W.S. Anderson, to go darker and R-rated. And then his vision got chopped down to the point that I just watched the theatrical version, the 95 minutes. And I was like, this feels like it was cut down a lot. Like it feels like there's chunks of information missing, and so you're saying that there is a completed, like, decent quality director's cut out there?
Well, I don't think that the extended cut that was released is complete. Mm-hmm. If I remember correctly, there were actually some sequences that were lost or have yet to be uncovered. Okay, yeah. But there is a longer version that does add some additional story and gore to the film, and in the director's commentary, and I'll be a little bit vulgar here, but you'll understand where I'm going with it. He describes the scenes showing the death and torture of the original crew as an orgiastic death scene where they tore each other apart while fucking each other. Wow. And so it probably would stand to reason that, maybe he did get some porn actors in on that. Mm-hmm. Something else that I thought was kind of interesting is that those sequences would normally be the kind of thing that was handled by a second unit director, but for those specific sequences, Anderson took a separate crew and shot those during days that the main film crew had off because he wanted to be involved with the crafting of those sequences.
What a shame that we never really got to see that, like his vision kind of brought to life in the proper way then. And to Paramount's credit, that they were willing to spend, I guess, $60 million on this movie that it sounds like was never really going to be a mainstream success. I mean, let's be realistic about it. I don't think that movie back then now would really make a huge amount of that budget back, just because it does feel like something that is so niche and so specific in the the audience that it would appeal to.
It seems like it was destined to become a cult film. And in my opinion, for whatever it's worth, I still to this day think that that's the best film that Anderson has made. I never watched his earlier film, Soldier. I didn't really care about watching the Mortal Kombat movie. I was appalled at how the Resident Evil films were handled.
I was going to say the 14 Resident Evil movies he did after this.
Well, so Resident Evil was the game that got me to buy the first PlayStation. Okay. And there were rumors, and I guess they were substantiated to some degree, But the rumor was that George Romero was going to direct a Resident Evil movie based on that first game. And so, I was bummed when he left, but I figured, hey, I'll give this a shot when it comes out. And the first Resident Evil movie is more of an action movie with just some horror trappings placed on it. I was thoroughly unimpressed.
Yeah, I saw Resident Evil, I think, in theaters, and I was like, okay, I'm good now. I saw Alien versus Predator when it came out. Again, another hugely missed opportunity. And I was a fan of Mortal Kombat when it came out, just because I was like 12 when it came out, so I was really into the games at that point. But I mean, looking back on it, it's not, a great movie or anything. It's just it's a nostalgic thing for me. So yeah, he's got a really interesting, all over the place filmography. Again, more focused on sort of the B movie sci-fi horror cross section.
Right. And he seems like a nice guy, and everything that I've seen and read about him. It's just so much of his filmography doesn't resonate with me, but this really did. And the movie came out at this interesting time where, for a film like this, you were still seeing a combination of different approaches to the effects. There was some early CG used. Some of it has held up better than other. There are parts of it that look really dated, but there was also a lot of use of matte paintings and model work, and some of the model work looks really, really good.
Yeah, the practical effects I thought looked really solid. The design elements, the production design of the film. But yeah, as you mentioned, like the opening, one of the opening shots, there's all those items like cans or whatever floating. Yes. And I was like, oh my gosh, wow, this is like really, really bad effects. It's just, the 90s when CG was in its infancy.
Yes, there's a wrench that flies by, and there's also a book that has a picture of Paul Anderson that says something like Anderson, a life in film or something like that. It's basically like just a brief director cameo of a supposed autobiography that he wrote at some point.
Nice.
Well, you mentioned the design of the film, and there are some really interesting aspects to that as well. The design of the actual Event Horizon ship was based in part on elements taken from Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, which I thought was really, really cool. And they also they attributed some of the visual design to being inspired by photographer Joel Peter Witkin, who some people may already be familiar with. A lot of Witkin's style was aped for the 9 Inch Nails video for the song Closer. So it's really this strange mix of the beautiful and the horrific. But the film was shot by a cinematographer named Adrian Biddle, who was the first person signed to the production, aside from, the director and the writer. And he has a pretty impressive filmography. Sadly, he passed away, I believe, in 2005. He was relatively young. He was only 53 years old. But his resume includes movies like Aliens and The Princess Bride and Willow and Thelma and Louise. He worked on some very big films with some very influential directors. And I think the look of the film, even though sometimes the limitations of technology or budget show through, I think the look of the film is pretty impressive.
Yeah, the core and like the interior of the film is just it really holds up in that regard, I think, and it helps to distinguish this movie from, again, a lot of the other sort of sci-fi horror noir films that were happening at the time. I think it's probably one of the strongest elements of the production. And then you have, the makeup and the design, especially later on with Weir, which, again, as you already mentioned, Hellraiser, I already had that in my notes, because he's talking about a dimension of pure chaos, pure evil. I was like, okay, so this sounds like we need an Event Horizon Hellraiser crossover, because that sounds like exactly where the Cenobites come from.
Right. Well, and so on the director's commentary, they mention Hellraiser as being an influence to their design of the gravity core. But honestly, I have to say, I believe it probably goes a little bit deeper than that, because what we see and what we experience throughout the film, it does feel very much at home in the Hellraiser universe, and arguably is a better representation of what Hellraiser in space could be than the segments that were included in Bloodline. Especially towards the end, when Weir has fully gone over to the dark side, or whatever you want to call it. All of those effects, the runes and the cuttings just carved into his skin all over his entire body. That is practical effects. He's basically, wearing a full body prosthetic. And that to me is one of the most striking images throughout the film.
Since this movie does have such visual similarities to something like Hellraiser, let's talk about that franchise for a second. I have only seen the first one, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. I'm assuming you're more familiar with the Hellraiser franchise. Are there any, highlights in that series that you would recommend to myself and listeners?
Well, so when it comes to Hellraiser, I will slum it. There are a lot of really bad Hellraiser movies, but there's only one of them that I don't have on my shelf. So realistically, for most people, I think you're going to be completely okay just sticking with Hellraiser, or maybe Hellraiser and Hellbound, Hellraiser 2. Okay. Those two are pretty much hands down far and above the rest of the series. Hellraiser 3 tries to turn it into like a late 80s, early 90s slasher, and fails on a lot of levels. It has a few memorable sequences, but then you get into things with like a Cenobite that throws CDs at people to kill people, and it gets ridiculous. Hellraiser 4 was a very interesting idea. The concept behind that film was tracing the box from its origin, back in, I believe, the times of the French Revolution, up through modern day, and then on to its supposed ultimate destruction in the future. And so there are sequences that take place on a space station that is actually constructed to be a box in its own right that can destroy the lament configuration. If I remember correctly, Bloodline was the last one to get a theatrical release. Everything past then has been direct to video, and a number of those films, which I believe there are another 6, or at this point maybe even 7 films. I believe it's 6. A good number of those are existing scripts that kind of had the Hellraiser template shoehorned in. Some of them are passable. A lot of them are really terrible. But even the ones that some people really dislike, there are certain elements that are worthy of checking out. In fact, the first direct-to-video one, Hellraiser Inferno, it kind of establishes a template that we see play out several times, where it's kind of like a detective story, and the detective gets pulled into the world of the Cenobites, and, is the cop good? Is the cop dirty? What all is going on? But that one was directed by Scott Derrickson, who would go on to direct films like Sinister and Doctor Strange. So it's kind of interesting to see a director like that early in their career working on an established property that had kind of maybe had a little of the shine taken off. But then you get into things like Hellworld, where it all takes place in like this Hellraiser online video game, but it does feature Lance Henriksen. The only one that I don't own is Hellraiser Revelation, which was just a last-minute rush job so that Dimension could keep the rights. And it features what people often refer to as Fat Pinhead or Great Value Pinhead. You may have seen those pictures online, but the actor, who curiously enough is not a fat person, but in the makeup he just looks chubby, and he doesn't cut the imposing figure that Doug Bradley did. So after that one, there was one other one that came out, Hellraiser Judgment. Hellraiser was played by a different actor, Paul Taylor, who is up in the Dallas area. And I thought that he did a really good job in it. Now, that film also is not completely successful. It's low budget, but it has some interesting ideas that kind of expand the world. So, like I said, there's only one of them that I don't own. I revisit them pretty frequently, but there's more bad than good in that series. Yeah,
it does feel like one of those horror franchises that had a really strong start and then just descended into straight to video. I don't know. It's an interesting one because you've seen so many of these old horror franchises getting rebooted or restarted or whatever. So I'm doing a little research as we're talking about it, and it looks like there is some kind of a reboot / TV series in the works for Hellraiser. I think there's a lot of potential there. And this movie, if nothing else, made me want to be like, crap, I need to go back and watch some of that, at least the second Hellraiser, because the first one ends with sort of a, direct leading into the second film. So I never actually got to see that finish playing out. So I would I wanted to have a little bit of a Hellraiser corner because I figured you have some insight that I don't have. So I'll definitely check out Hellbound.
And I do believe that there's a lot of Hellraiser's DNA in Event Horizon. You just can't deny it from the look of the film, from designs of portions of the ship to just the whole idea of this hellish dimension that these things are coming out of. That's Hellraiser through and through. And to me, it is so interesting that within roughly a year's time, we got Hellraiser's take on what would this look like in outer space, and we got Event Horizon. And Event Horizon, out of the two, I think is a much more successful film in what it tries to accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit about the performances and the cast here, because I knew about Laurence Fishburne and Sam Neill, but I didn't realize Kathleen Quinlan, Jolie Richardson, Richard T. Jones, and Jason Isaacs, Sean Pertwee, who was on just watched for 5 seasons on Gotham as Alfred Pennyworth. I really like the cast here and the characters that they create. There is a certain element of, well, this is the science guy, this one's the funny one, this is the no nonsense, muscle or whatever. But I think for the most part, they lend a lot of gravitas to this. And, you're dealing with hell in space, essentially. So you kind of need the actors to ground that emotionally. And I think this cast does a tremendous job in doing so.
Absolutely. And like we touched on earlier, they do have that kind of like almost familial camaraderie that you saw in Alien. But they're unique. Now, I don't think that everything works 100%. The whole calling the one guy Baby Bear just that gets on my nerves for some reason. And then there's the ridiculously funny moment where I forget the character's name. But he is outside in the spacesuit and he's zooming across. He's, here I come, motherfuckers.
I think that's what's it? Richard T. Jones. That's Cooper, I think, right?
Cooper, I believe you're right. Yes.
Yeah, there's a couple moments where people yell just randomly, where Laurence Fishburne's Captain Miller is like trying to get to Justin because he's on this, he's like, I'm not going to go back there. I'm going to, decompress myself and commit suicide. And he's like flying towards the ship. He's like, you're not going to die. And he's like, Justin. I was like, okay, dial it down, guys. There's a few moments like that. Again, very late 90s action movie. Like when all the, Schwarzenegger and Stallone had to like yell / murmur every 2 seconds. That was another moment. I was like, okay, they started dating it.
It is a strong cast. Sean Pertwee just the year before had come out of Train Spotting, which I think was probably the first thing that I had seen him in, and so those roles couldn't be further apart. But I love his character here. I think that Jolie Richardson is really, really good in this role, as is Kathleen Quinlan, if you'll just excuse the whole Baby Bear thing. And I like the fact that pretty much everybody gets a moment. Not everyone gets a big flashy moment, but everybody gets a moment that defines their character or makes them stand out. And I actually misspoke. I was thinking about Sean Pertwee, and he was not actually in Trainspotting. I was wrong on that point.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he's really good in this. I mean, they all are, like you said, and I think the way that the apparitions, I guess we'll call them, the different visions that they have, it felt to me, again, drawing a parallel with another TV show that I watched. It reminded me it was very similar to something like Lost, where it's like everybody had this emotional baggage, this secret, this fear, or whatever, and it's like basically trying to force them to face it. And I thought that was a really smart way to have this, have this chaos, have the jump scares and all that other good stuff, this horrific imagery, but also keep it character based, where everybody, it touched you learn about everybody's past as the movie's progressing, as you're witnessing what images are haunting them and all that. And I thought that was really effective.
Yes. There's that instance with Sam Neill where he's seeing his wife attempt suicide. Everybody kind of has these character moments, and I can't remember fully. Is that sequence also in the theatrical cut, or is that something that was just put back into the extended cut?
I believe it is. It might probably more graphic or more explicit in the extended cut, but it is in the theatrical version as well. Yeah. Okay.
I mean that there's not an outrageous amount of gore in that sequence, but that's a pretty horrific scene. He's sitting there reliving this memory, powerless to do anything about it, powerless to change anything about it. And that to me is pretty horrific, even without buckets of blood. One thing that stood out to me too, that I think was pretty effective, is there are several sequences throughout the film where you see people who have either clawed their own eyes out or had their eyes removed. Yep. And I guess originally they were going to use an effect where they just used white contacts and had the people's eyes whited out. And so this was something that combined a practical prosthetic with some additional CGI work. And while the CGI is not 100% effective, it still looks pretty disturbing.
Yeah, I think it mostly works. And yeah, it's funny because I hadn't seen this movie until recently. It's one of those that I was aware of, and I've seen frames of it all over and over the years, like Sam Neill with no eyes. So I was almost kind of waiting. I'm like, all right, when's he cutting his eyes out? And then when it happened, I was like, oh, there it is. That's the part I remember from just like, random, whatever on the internet, or like looking at the video store and seeing the box and things like that. But yeah, like he says, towards the end of the movie, it's like, where we're going, we don't need eyes to see. I thought that was... It works. I mean, it's not, like you said, it doesn't look 100% realistic, but it's enough to, those are supposed to be mostly apparitions and mostly visions anyway. So it kind of lends it almost an otherworldly feel, which I think in a way kind of strengthens the moment.
Yes. And then, we see an effect that I think was probably done a little bit better in another movie that I'll mention in a moment, but it's still pretty effective when the gravity comes on and the frozen body drops and just shatters into pieces. I remember that being a moment that stood out to me. I think Jason X probably pulls it off a little bit better, where someone's head is frozen in liquid nitrogen and then smashes it. Yeah. But that moment does stand out, and evidently when they were testing the effect, the crews put a Barbie doll inside the model of the body, and so when they were testing it out the first time, they dropped the body, it shatters, and out pops this Barbie doll. So one of the other things that they mentioned as kind of being an inspiration to this story about a ghost ship, basically, is tales of ghost ships when we think about them more commonly. And they specifically mentioned the legends around the Mary Celeste and the Flying Dutchman. And I think that there is always just something frightening about anything that has been abandoned and shouldn't be. That's something that from my earliest childhood, hearing about something like the Roanoke colony that disappeared, there's just something inherently haunting about that, and I think they use that to good effect here.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a campfire story element to this discovery as far as what happened to the Event Horizon, and then the garbled message, which we then see sort of. I don't know. Do we see it or do the characters see? I think they see a video of what happened as well, briefly.
Yeah, and the video is kind of garbled, and that's where they pull the audio from. And at first they think that the Latin says "save me," but then later on they get the full transcription, and that's not at all what was said.
Save yourself from hell, basically. Yes. Yeah, that's and it's so funny too, because part of the reason I didn't watch this movie until recently is because I was like, oh, I've heard that's some crazy shit. I don't know. I have to like make time and clear my head before I watch that. And then watching the movie, I was like, this wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be, because I think probably the mystique that's surrounded the film in the 20 plus years since it came out, regarding all the stuff that was cut and all the original version of the film and what it was supposed to entail, how detailed it was supposed to get into what was happening.
Yes. Well, and I will say that myself and some of my horror movie loving friends, when the extended version was first put out on DVD, we sat at home with the remote and just, forwarded frame by frame through some of those scenes. And there are some horrific things that are shown, but it's almost a subliminal effect, even in the extended cut, because it's so quickly. So your mind just barely has a chance to register what's going on. If you remember, in the design of the gravity core room, it's almost like a spherical room that houses the core itself, and there are these big spikes coming out from the walls. And so there are images of people that are impaled on those spikes. There are images of people that have had their eyes ripped out and their mouths damaged. It's pretty horrific stuff.
Do you think that the movie, those sequences would have been more effective had they left those in and really kind of focused on them? Or do you think in a way it's almost more effective as far as creating genuine scares to just have everything flash by, sort of disorienting?
That's a difficult question to answer, because I think in some instances less is more. Mm-hmm. I will admit to being a fan of a number of gore films, but a lot of times with those, after you've seen them a time or two, especially as you get older and you see more movies, both good and bad, it almost starts to take on an unintentionally comedic effect, because you can tell what the gag is. You can see it coming a mile away. You can tell where the prosthetics are. I think that there's probably a middle ground where they could have shown a little bit more, but still kept that almost subliminal feel to it. But I think that if everything was shown, if it was just all laid out, then it probably would not have the same impact.
Yeah, I think the movie wisely doesn't give up its entire hand in that regard. And but it's considering a movie like this that has that whole legend behind the production and what the movie could have been, I think it's always kind of interesting to speculate on how that would have worked exactly.
Sure. And, if 5 or 10 years down the road, someone discovers the missing sequences and they restore it and put it out again, I'd probably buy it just to watch it. And at that point I might say, you know what? They should have put that in. But I'd just as likely be saying, no, it's probably better that they kept it out. I think that leaving it up to the imagination of the viewers a lot of times is the more effective route. And I fully say that as someone who likes some pretty brutal horror movies.
That's kind of a decent transition into, you mentioned at the top of the show, you want to talk about the Amazon TV show that they're developing. So how do you, I guess, what do we know about that so far? I know Adam Wingard is involved and probably going to direct some of that. So go ahead.
So we're going to enter the realm of pretty much pure speculation at this point. So this kind of caught fire back in early August. Variety had an article stating that Adam Wingard was going to be executive producing and directing a series based on Event Horizon for Amazon. And then as soon as they put that up, countless other sites picked it up and ran with it. And so in preparing for recording this show tonight, I went back and tried to chase down and see what other information is out there. And at least publicly available information, there's not a whole lot. So what we do know is that Amazon and Paramount are working together. Wingard is set to produce and direct at least some of it. Some of the original producers of the film are on board as well, but that may just be in an executive producer role where they just kind of have their names on it and get a cut. Mm-hmm. There is not really any time frame for us to expect this. There has been no talent announced. If you go onto IMDb, there is a brief entry, but you can't see really anything other than the title unless you are subscribed to the professional service. And so there's not a whole lot out there. But the idea of this being done is pretty intriguing to me. So Adam Wingard's filmography is not unlike that of Paul Anderson, although I will say that overall I like more films that Wingard has done than Anderson has done. That said, I don't like everything that he's done, but he's done some pretty effective things. My favorites being You're Next and The Guest, which came out back to back almost several years ago and are really effective. So the thought of him taking on this property is pretty intriguing to me. He often works with Simon Barrett as a writing partner, whose work I really enjoy. And he also often works with Steve Moore on the soundtrack and score. And if Steve Moore gets attached to this, I will freak out. He used to be in a band called Zombie, and I don't think Zombie has broken up, but Steve Moore today is primarily working on scoring movies. He scored The Guest. Recently, he has scored a lot of Joe Bigos's films. So he recently worked on Bliss and VFW. Really, really great work that's inspired a lot by John Carpenter and Vangelis and synth scores from, back in the 70s and 80s.
So I think since this movie is essentially a cult classic, it's pretty clear that the show will probably just be a fresh restart. So what would you want that to be? What would you want it to cover, and what level of gore would you like to see it go to?
Well, so we're completely spitballing here.
Oh, for sure.
But, let's just say, a typical streaming show first season is probably going to get, let's just say 9 episodes. Some of them are shorter, some of them are longer, but 8 or 9 episodes is going to be kind of the sweet spot. So that gives you a lot more time than you had with the original. So I could almost see something that runs parallel storylines where you have the crew of the Lewis and Clark going out to search for and recover the Event Horizon playing out in the present storyline. And then you also have a parallel storyline that's showing you what happened with the Event Horizon. I think that would lend itself to fleshing out the story and the world a little bit more. It would give you an opportunity to throw some additional scares in there. It's got some familiar storylines for fans of the original film, but it's also got enough fresh stuff to keep them guessing. That's kind of what I would think. What I don't want is just telling the same story and padding it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would be shocked if the original crew of the Event Horizon isn't a central part of it. Like either they do sort of a dual focus, like you mentioned, or that we just follow the initial Event Horizon crew before any of the things happens with the Lewis and Clark. But I actually kind of like your idea because I think that lends to a lot of dramatic cuts of the crew of the Event Horizon going out there like, I got a good feeling about this mission, and then cut to what Lewis and Clark is discovering, and you're like, oh, no, it did not go according to plan. I think that kind of thing it could be interesting as far as contrasting those two missions and sort of the crew members of the Event Horizon kind of appearing to the crew members of Lewis and Clark and that kind of thing. I think that's kind of a smart way to approach it, and I definitely think they're not going to do an expanded version on this. I think just because there is so much. I mean, this movie barely scratches the surface of a potential mythology expansion that can happen with the dimension that's on the other end of that black hole. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of room for growth here.
Well, and so much of what we saw in the film, the abilities of the Event Horizon and this power that they've harnessed, deals with, kind of bending the distance in space. But, they could also start to play with, okay, how does it affect time? And that kind of brings some different things in where you could play with those parallel storylines as well. And like you mentioned a moment ago, seeing the original crew appear to the crew of the Lewis and Clark or whoever is trying to rescue them. So I think it opens it up for some pretty interesting interplay between the past and the present. I'm down for it. I hope that this is not something that just gets stuck in development hell. I know that Wingard right now is on post-production for Godzilla vs. Kong, and that's been pushed around a couple of times. I hope that movie is not either, experiencing some production troubles or ends up being a flop and potentially impacting this, because I'd like to see him given the opportunity to tackle something like this. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of genre television right now on streaming, especially, and I think this film has probably enough support to give that show kind of a leg up on things like what Amazon have, the Good Omens show, and a lot of like the fantasy sci-fi kind of sphere. So I think look at what we're seeing right now on HBO with The Watchmen. All of a sudden has a TV show, and it's like a huge thing that everybody's talking about. I still haven't checked it out myself, but I think that's kind of a testament to these properties and how they're able to find new avenues to expand on the world of the story. Because in the case of Watchmen, it's a beloved comic, but that film did like okay at the box office, basically. So it's interesting that they're taking another crack at that. So I think there's an Event Horizon show could definitely be something worthwhile, I think.
Okay, so two thoughts here. First is kind of a footnote, because I was thinking about Watchmen a little bit earlier and didn't bring it up. But since that door has been open, now I'm going to. I would recommend checking it out. I was very, very dubious about them bringing this back as a series, and I have been consistently impressed. I love it. It's probably one of my favorite things that I've seen on HBO in a long time. And it's another instance of Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross doing some incredible score work. So I would highly recommend that. In fact, earlier this week, I went back and revisited the director's cut of the Watchmen movie. Mm-hmm. And I saw the theatrical cut the weekend that it opened. I liked it then. I like it now. I don't think it's a perfect movie, but I enjoy it quite a bit. And I can understand some of the changes that were made. But I love the new series. There's only 2 episodes left at the time that we're recording this. They haven't said whether or not they're going to attempt a second season. Damon Lindelof has said that if HBO wants to do a second season, he most likely will not be back. It will be someone else tackling it. So who knows what the future holds for that. But it is well worth your time if you're even the least bit interested.
I am actually. I also really like the Zack Snyder film. I actually have the what is it, the ultimate cut, or the one that's like 3.5 out with the animated sequence edited into it. I actually think that, it's got its cheesy moments in that film, but I do for the most part really enjoy that world. I like the graphic novels quite a bit. So I am very curious about the TV show. So now, yeah, you're giving me an extra push to finally jumping on board that. I wonder if for that series, and I don't know if this is something that even Event Horizon could embrace. I mean, there's been quite a bit of success in the last several years with anthology series. So I almost wonder if they do a second season of Watchmen, if they would just follow different characters in this world and kind of expand on it that way. That way, each season kind of has its own identity and rather than having a new creative team or showrunner come in and take a story and kind of bomb it, they create a new story to tell. So I wonder if that may be something that they'll be exploring.
I think that would be the wisest way to do it if they do opt for a second season. So that was my footnote. Now my other thought is about Amazon. So when this was first announced, I felt a little bit concerned simply because there's almost two eras of original programming for Amazon. Do you remember when they released like maybe 8 or 10 different pilots for different things that they were considering?
Yeah, Zombieland was one of them, I remember.
Yeah, there were a lot of bad ones. There were a couple that were okay. I enjoyed their take on the Tick, but a lot of them were just not good. So that was my immediate knee-jerk reaction. But then after I sat and thought about it a little bit, I haven't watched everything that they've been doing recently, but I watched a couple of episodes of Good Omens. I liked that. What I really was impressed by was The Boys. So I think that given a darker, challenging property with what they're doing today, they could probably have some success with it. So my initial fear on that may have just been a knee-jerk reaction and not anything based in current reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think Amazon's still kind of trying to find its way as far as what its brand identity is as an original content creator. I think The Boys has probably helped that a little bit more, and I think that they could probably benefit from the whatever cachet they would get from taking on a cult property like Event Horizon and building on it. So, yeah, I think that there's a lot to work with here. So, John, is there anything about the film Event Horizon that we haven't talked about that you wanted to mention before we start winding down?
Well, the only thing that I was thinking about as we were just talking over the last couple of minutes, you mentioned the anthology idea. Mm-hmm. And there is a way that if they chose to approach the series from a similar standpoint, they could both go off in a completely new direction, but also tie it back to the original. So at the end of the film, pretty much the only one that has survived is Jolie Richardson's character. And we're kind of left with this question is like, okay, is she carrying this with her, or was it all destroyed back on the Event Horizon? So, there would be an opportunity to kind of almost use that character as the MacGuffin carrying the story forward if they didn't want to go back and tread ground that was already tread by the movies. Mm-hmm. That's somewhat intriguing to me, but I also don't see how you can really have an Event Horizon series without having the Event Horizon.
Right, and I don't think that the film has enough brand recognition for them to be like, you all know that movie from 22 years ago that nobody saw in theaters, right? We're all on the same page with Event Horizon. And then like 10% of the audience will be like, we are. I think that's an interesting idea, but I feel like that would be more the second season. Like do a first season expanding on this story and both crews, and then have that be like an avenue for the second season following with this whoever survivors, and maybe they take the possession of whatever was on the ship and they take that with them somewhere else, to a space station, to something else, and it kind of travels with that person. I think that would be, now I'm thinking about that Denzel Washington movie Fallen, where she just touches and it travels. So I wonder if it would be almost that kind of logic might happen. Something with that. I think there's a lot of meat on the bones of a space meets hell kind of parallel, and I think that someone like a Damon Lindelof or someone like that could really wring a lot of thematic juice out of that exploration of where do those cross, where do they diverge, and could they technically be the same thing?
Yes, and I would like to see if they pursue it. I would like to see some of that. What's the word that I'm looking for? Some of that abstract nature left in to where it doesn't necessarily fall firmly on the side of science or faith, where the viewers can struggle with that just as much as the characters may.
Yeah. Do you like the way that the theatrical cut ends, where it's just the doors closing suddenly, or do you feel like that is in a way sort of a cop-out?
I think it's kind of like a cliffhanger. I mean, I think it sets you up for a continuation of the story that, at least up to this point, we've never gotten it.
Right.
And I also think it kind of falls in line with a sequence that we see early on in the film. There's that sequence where Sam Neill is in the I believe he's shaving. And then the blinds that are covering the window to space open up, and you kind of pull out, and there's this very disorienting pull back where the camera's twisting, and you're seeing this model kind of spinning, but it's actually the camera that's moving. So we have those two where there's this portal that opens up early in the movie, and then there's this portal that closes, and all we're left is blackness, and I believe the prodigy as the credits roll.
Yeah, I like that. I think there's an argument to be made either way with the ending of the theatrical cut, because it is one of those like doom final jump scare, like almost the end of reminded me of the end of Carrie, where she's at Carrie's grave and she pops out, and then it's a nightmare, yes. Or is it that kind of thing. But yeah, I hope that if they do the show, and again, I hope that it isn't something that just falls apart in development hell, ironically enough, considering the themes of the movie, that they do maintain that open to, they keep it open to interpretation, so the viewers don't get a clear cut answer one way or another. Because I think that's what makes it, what makes the film really, gives added depth to what could otherwise be sort of just a sci-fi horror B movie. It adds that extra element where you're like, well, geez, what if hell is that? What if it is just another dimension, or maybe it's not? I like that idea, and I think there's a lot to work with there. So Jon Cohorn,
because
go ahead.
Then you get into the whole discussion of, is this actually evil,
right?
Or is it just chaos that's beyond our understanding? Because either one of those are potentially terrifying. But I think it's something cool for both the characters and the viewers to wrestle with. Yeah,
it's that old thing, like magic is just like science that we don't understand. Magic or witchcraft. Yeah, it's that whole thing. So I definitely recommend by both of us, check out Event Horizon. It's actually streaming, ironically enough, or maybe appropriately enough, on Amazon Prime Video. So they're already basically in the Event Horizon business. They just need to sign some extra paperwork, I guess, to make it happen and get that green light going. So Jon Cohorn, tell people where they can find you on social media.
Okay, on Twitter, where I usually do most of my gabbing about movies, it's at the Horror Aisle. Or they can check out my writing at modernhorrors.com.
Awesome. Jon, thank you so much for coming back on the show and getting me to finally watch this and overcome teenage me's hesitation of finally biting the bullet and watching Event Horizon. We'll have to find something else equally interesting to talk about and have you on again sometime soon.
That sounds great, Rob. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jon. If you're interested in joining me on the show to chat about one of your favorite films, head on over to crookedtable.com/guest. Or you can consider supporting the show at patreon.com/crookedtable. Of
course, you can always find more podcasts, reviews, videos, and other movie-related goodies over at crookedtable.com. Until next time, this has been the Crooked Table Podcast, and I've been Rob.
This has been a production of crookedtable.com. All rights reserved.
CROOKED.